Hello, everyone, and welcome back to EU DisinfoLab's conference on disinformation virtually this year. Thanks for staying with us into the second session of the day. In today's session, we're shining a spotlight now on the role specifically of civil society and in their response to dis and misinformation during the coronavirus pandemic and the infodemic. In this session, our panelists will reflect on the challenges faced by civil society and the lessons learned, or I should say still learning, from this very unique period of time. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julie Posetti as the chair of this panel. Dr. Posetti is Global Director of Research at the International Center for Journalists. She's also a senior researcher affiliated with the Center for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield and at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. She is a multi-award-winning Australian-born journalist and a UN-published author with expertise at the intersection of digital journalism practice, disinformation, media freedom, journalism safety, and gender. I'm going to give Julie the floor to then introduce our panelists, but I also want to remind the audience that we are taking questions for all the panelists in the Q&A, so just put those questions in the chat and reply to everyone. My moderator, Anna, and I will be able to then deliver those questions to the panelists. And another reminder also that we are recording the session, so please bear this in mind as well. And now over to you, Dr. Posetti. Julie, I think you might be on mute. It's one of the lovely features of webinars, so let's see if we can.
I'm sorry. I've hosted so many of these things, and my job usually involves telling everybody else to unmute. I've now unmuted, so hopefully you can hear me. So what I was starting to say is that I'm thrilled that we're joined by three impressive speakers today from academia and civil society. So Dr. Claire Wardle, who's the co-founder of First Draft, Hubert, who's a researcher. Hubert, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, a researcher and PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute, and Alaphilippe, who is, of course, the executive director of EU DisinfoLab. And the theme of this session is civil society's response to the infodemic, which is that term that the World Health Organization has given prominence, which relates to the avalanche of both information and disinformation that we're trying to wade through in the context of this crisis. And the framing for this session is about the ways in which civil society has worked as independent organisations and collaboratively after the outbreak of COVID-19. So we're going to reflect on the challenges faced by civil society and the lessons that have been learned so far, let's say at the end of the first wave of the pandemic as we really careen headlong into the second wave. And as Claire said in her introduction, I am a UN published author, that's true, but I want to draw your attention to a very big study that was published last week and launched this week by the UN, UNESCO and the International Telecommunications Union, a book presenting a global study of disinformation responses in the context of freedom of expression challenges. It's called The Balancing Act, Countering Disinformation While Respecting Freedom of Expression. I'm going to put the link in the chat, and I'm mentioning it because I co-authored this book, but it is really a work of collaboration of an interdisciplinary nature. And I mean that not just in terms of academic interdisciplinarity. We certainly had a lot of diverse skills and expertise in that regard. But my colleague, Professor Kalina Boncheva, pulled together an incredibly diverse team which involved civil society researchers, journalists, and academics. So it really is kind of like a living example of how research can be conducted in a collaborative way, engaging civil society and hopefully pushing the policy debates forward. So I'll commend it to you. Now, just let me give you a bit more of an introduction to our speakers today. before we get straight into this session. So Claire Wardle, I've introduced to you. She leads strategic direction and research for First Draft. She's formerly a traditional academic at the University of Cardiff, but she has forged this new path in civil society via work with the BBC, focused on social media verification. And Hubert is a PhD student, as I said, at the Oxford Internet Institute. He's contributed to a number of recent publications, including a report on junk news narratives during the 2019 UK election. And Alaphilippe, Executive Director of DisinfoLab, has 15 years experience in digital communications, planning and implementing campaigns in both the public and private sectors. And just another reminder to the audience, please put your questions in the channel that's labelled Q&A. And make sure that you send them to all panelists so that you're not just chatting among yourselves, so that I can reach in and pull some of those questions out towards the end. This is going to work as a series of presentations followed by a Q&A. So stay with us, and we look forward to chatting to you towards the end of the session. And now I'm going to hand over to you, Claire Wardle, who's going to talk about working with journalists and newsrooms and the difficulties that have been encountered in the context of countering the COVID-19 disinformation crisis. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks so much for the invitation to talk today. I'm sure there are lots of people who are watching who I know very well, we're friends, and it's very sad that we're still doing all of these in squares. But I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about supporting newsrooms during an infodemic, which is what we've been doing for the last 6 months. So next slide, please. See if this works. I mean, a GIF doesn't really work virtually, but I think all of us on this call who are working in this space are absolutely exhausted. I mean, I thought I worked hard before. I have never done the hours that we're doing now, and it is non-stop. And the dual purposes of the US election and the pandemic means it's unbelievable. But anyway, so next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges associated with this relentless demand for accurate information, when actually a lot of it has been in short supply. Next slide, please. And very early in the pandemic, I did a webinar with Joe Smizer from Public Good Project, and he said something that's really stuck with me, which is we need to think about this as crisis communications. When there's a wildfire, you listen to the police chief and the fire chief, and the fire chief says, the fire right now is here. Tomorrow it could be here, here, or here. I can't tell you that, but follow me and I will tell you everything I know as I know it. I promise you. And we have completely failed to do that with COVID, and we unfortunately have talked about it in a way that wasn't the case, which was this is a new virus. We know almost nothing. Follow us. We will be honest with you, but we don't know everything and we are learning, and this is how knowledge emerges. And so I think what we have failed to do is to recognize what we didn't know and to say that clearly to the audience. Next slide, please. So very early in the pandemic, we were working with Google and their question hub, which was basically sourcing the questions that people were asking that was rolled out in a few countries as a pilot, which was if they didn't get the answers on Google, a pop-up would say, what would you like to know? So if you can keep clicking through, Alex. These are just some of the different blocks of questions. People had so many questions and they were the same questions across the world, but we didn't have good answers. So think about this. These are people going to Google for answers. There was nothing there, and they were having to put it into a question hub. So like, can somebody help me with these questions? I mean, it's kind of stunning how little we knew and how problematic that was. Next slide, please. So in preparing for this presentation, I just went back through Google Drive. This is just within First Draft. This is just a screenshot of some of the briefings we were writing for journalists. Some of these were like 18 pages a day, just trying to stay on top of it and going back and saying, oh, I remember now the hashtag film your hospital, which was people going into hospitals to say there are no patients there. Fauci in the deep state, virus on surfaces, does it spread? DIY face masks. I mean, all of us must feel like a Doctor Who episode. I mean, it's kind of astonishing to look back now and say that was March 30th. It feels like another world. And I think we haven't had a time to stop and breathe yet and to recognize, because we're still in the middle of it, how we've managed as we've gone through that. Next slide, please. But what we all know is that there have been real problems here in terms of how some of the more traditional sources of information have acted in this space. So here's the retraction from the Lancet about hydroxychloroquine. It's hard for journalists to, A, write about science and science studies when this is changing all the time. We've talked at length about preprints And the idea that previously there'd be these very small studies that would come out and journalists wouldn't even know how to find them. Now there are preprint bots that journalists can follow that tell you there's a, but we've got ourselves into real problems here with pushing out information based on very small studies. I think if you can just advance, Alex, the next slide. So something, the map. So something we've just launched this week, actually a project that we did with also the amazing University of Sheffield. I don't really know why when they sleep, but we got a grant from Aspen Digital to basically look at what we're calling data deficits, which is kind of similar to data voids, but this question of how do we look at the information supply chain? So how do we compare what people are asking questions about versus what available information we have? And this is just a pilot, it's a dashboard that we're trying to build on, but it's really interesting to look at where there are real problems in terms of what people want and what they can get. And those things often don't align, and we don't have good tools other than Google Trends, which is better than nothing, but there are still flaws in that, to understand what it is that people are searching for and how we can create content that can, answer these questions that audiences have. Next slide, please. The next thing I wanted to talk about was this just challenge of knowing what to focus on due to the overwhelming levels of misinformation, some very important, some trivial, and some potentially coordinated. I mean, there are a number of fact checkers and other organizations doing this work in real time. It's been very difficult to coordinate where to put resources, what was most useful or not. So next slide, please. There was this big study recently that I think many of us saw. I mean, even the BBC ran 800 people died specifically because of misinformation. Full Fact then came out and said, oh, could we be a little bit more careful about those numbers? So again, as ever, we have to be very aware of what we're writing. But I mean, for example, people thinking that alcohol was a preventative cure for COVID did lead to death. That was a really important story. Did we get that out quickly enough? Were we able to reach people quickly enough? Maybe not. Maybe, unfortunately, after what happened in Iran, that traveled. But we've got so much to research now to figure out some of these timeline questions. Next slide, please. Things like CDS in Latin America. As ever, we need to be very, very aware of how misinformation is crossing borders and the challenges of the poor translation tools that we have and the way that we don't necessarily connect as well. I mean, IFCN has done an amazing job. The fact checkers have this wonderful listserv that I'm on, and I see them working with each other to say, have you seen this? I've seen that, what's going on? But it's an email listserv. But for example, lots of rumors in Latin America about CDS, which is this idea of chlorine dioxide, that if you drink it, you'll be okay. How do we understand how this is moving? How do we understand the threats that are facing, one particular continent? This, again, seemed very serious. I don't think it necessarily got the coverage that it should have done. Again, we have some Spanish speakers, but when we're like, we're monitoring Latin America, that's not the way this has to happen. We have to ensure that we're working with communities on the ground to connect these dots. Next slide, please. And of course, the old WhatsApp messages. I mean, I think many of us who've worked globally have been screaming at the top of our lungs, can we take WhatsApp and closed messaging apps seriously? And for the first time, really, COVID was the time that in Western Europe and the US, people went, oh yeah, I can see this is a problem. But of course, we saw all of these, what seemed like low level, oh, you should gargle with salt water. I mean, I remember having a conversation with our editorial team being like, really? But of course, this was the thing that traveled the most widely because it resonated. It was easy to believe. And when people were trying to feel some sense of self-efficacy, sharing this with your family made you feel like you were doing something. And so this stuff actually became the things that we were seeing being shared more widely. Next slide, please. But there were the ones that were, so this one, you can see this is a European one, but this idea of drinking hot tea, the next one, Alex. The other thing about WhatsApp is we saw these, and I have said this on webinars again, so I'll put my hands up. I was in a very small group of disinformation experts, and very early on in the pandemic, somebody shared this in that group and said, from a credible source. Numpty here, who's meant to be the queen of this stuff, living alone in a studio apartment, away from my family, terrified, forwarded this. Because it did what I teach everybody to be aware of, is it was said it was from a credible source. I didn't do my own verification, and as ever, and I use this example to say all of us are susceptible. But then you may have seen this, next slide, Alex. A couple of weeks later, the New York Times basically said that these messages, which was about there's going to be a lockdown, there's tanks on the street, were actually sowed by Chinese agents. Was it? or was this part of the disinformation ecosystem that we now live in, where governments are fighting each other using disinformation? I don't know whether it was China. I never will know if it was China, probably. But this question of real-time coordination and the challenges of attribution is another layer to add to all of this. When do we have time to do the research to find out who's behind this versus debunking the content, pre-bunking the content, working with audiences? There's a lot to do. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to end with this, which I think all of us on this call know. We talk about it a lot. But what it means to do this work when you are living alone. Next slide, please. This is a part of my amazing team. As you can see, they're all beautiful, but they are all very young. And almost all of them, myself included, live alone. It's a very different situation when you do not see anybody apart from the person at the grocery store once a week when you are looking at this kind of content. And the hours that people are working, how you manage people, how you say, please put your camera on because I want to see your eyes this morning. I want to see how you're doing. I have never, ever, ever known a time where managing staff who are having to monitor this content, and again, monitor content in the US around watching your own community being brutalized. We have a young, diverse team for a reason. It has been a real challenge. And I don't know how we get past just paying lip service, but for many of us doing this work who are not-profits, not sleeping at night because we're worried about how do we pay our staff next year. I was just on a panel this morning with all of the platform people, and I said, you were all relying on civil society to do this work for you unless you give us the support to ensure that my staff don't have to work 14 hours because I can bring more staff in, so they only have to work a few hours. We are going to end up in a really serious situation with a lot of people burnt out. So I feel like, yes, it's good that we're talking about it, but unless it's an actual solution, which is ultimately resources, we're making the same mistakes as we've done previously. So sorry to end on that note, but I just think it's really important that when we talk about this stuff, what does it look like? And it looks like people with these smiley faces doing this work, and it is tough. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was actually, I mean, it's a difficult note to end on, but it's really important, and it's what we're finding within the organisation I work for, which serves journalists in a variety of ways. The picture that you showed of, you know, bright young people, it's the same in newsrooms all around the world, bright young people who are exhausted, approaching burnout, and not just young people as well. So this is absolutely a critical message. So we're going to move on now to Hubert, and we'll come back to Claire with questions later. You ready to go, Hubert?
I am.
Excellent.
Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, yes, go for it.
Great. Yeah, so thank you very much, Claire and Julie, for introducing me. Just like to echo, I've been feeling it within the OII and the Computational Propaganda Project, specifically where I also work, the mental toll of all of this. So just wanted to affirm that. But wanted to talk a little bit to everyone today about some of the work we've been doing around COVID-19, specifically, next slide, please. We've been monitoring the media ecosystem, English language media ecosystem since March. And to do that, we've been taking weekly snapshots of articles published online. You can find it all at the link below, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology we've been employing and then kind of the major themes we've seen popping up. I think we thought this is especially important at the time, as Claire mentions, where it's difficult enough for credible working journalists to document science and the ongoing rapid nature of this. Next slide, please. That it's important to understand what how this information is also propagated on the other side. So as we've been talking about, the infodemic is moving very fast, huge volumes of information, lots of unanswered questions, also back and forth in the science. So given the data access that we have, we thought these kind of weekly snapshots are an important contribution we can get from academia. Next slide, please. So what have you been doing? We've categorized different news outlets into three main categories that we use for comparison. One of them is mainstream, what we call mainstream. So these are well-known, reputable sources like the BBC, CNN, New York Times, etc. Junk news is our own categorization and includes outlets like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, and state-backed are government-funded entities like RT, CGTN, FreshTV, CRT. And I'll explain a little bit more about what Junkies is on the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is a typology we've developed from previous work. And there are 5 characteristics that we look out for, and we consider this holistically at a level of an outlet. So professionalism indicates whether an outlet provides clear information about the authors, editors, publishers, funding model, and typically a Junkies outlet will lack transparency, not publish corrections on debunked information, things like that. Style indicates emotionally driven language, typically a lot of hyperbole, ad hominem attacks, misleading headlines, excessive capitalization, logical fallacies, moving pictures. And credibility indicates a lot of false information, more likely to publish conspiracy theories. Information and sources are often employed strategically and often without consulting multiple sources or fact-checking. Bias indicates hyper-partisan nature of a lot of these outlets, typically highly opinionated. A lot of it is more commentary. And finally, counterfeit indicates the presentation of the outlet, so maybe copying fonts, styles, content strategies, so disguised as a kind of professional news outlet. So anything that has at least 3 of these we label as junk news. So next slide, please. So what is the data we've been collecting? Given the categorizations of news outlets we've just discussed, we can go track the links of the articles that are spread on social media. And so we collect from the YouTube API, a tool called CrowdTangle, and Twitter. So anyone who's not familiar with CrowdTangle, it's a Facebook-owned tool that allows tracking public posts on Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. And so given a link from the BBC or RT, we can go and see collect the following 2 metrics across all these platforms. Next slide, please. So we collect both what we call audience or social distribution network and engagements. And so the former on the left are just a sum of followers on Facebook pages, Instagram followers, subreddit members, YouTube subscribers. And one thing we'd like to highlight is we don't know what the actual distribution of these posts are. Only the platforms will know how many people a particular article that was shared was presented to, what is actually presented to. Right though, we have engagements, and these are kind of what we expect. So the likes, reactions on Facebook, comments, shares, retweets, and the sum of all of that for each article. So next slide, please. Once we have that, we're able to get a sense of how are people engaging, what are people engaging with on social media across these platforms. And one interesting finding we can get, and these are remarkably stable across the number of months we've done this now, is on the left. Apologies, the axis should be in millions. So the mainstream engagements overall typically are many times the engagements that state-backed news get, and a couple of times the junk news sites. But if you take a median, on average, the junk news and state-backs almost always outperform mainstream news. Next slide, please. So once we've collected all this information, yeah, there we go. What we do each week is there are 2 steps of an analysis. One of them is quantitative and the other is qualitative. First one, we call topic modeling, which is kind of clustering articles into different groups, and we get kind of keywords out of them. And from there, that kind of gives us a sense of what's been going on in the week that maybe we didn't get through our kind of other means of consuming media. And then allows me to dive deeper into the kind of mechanisms and strategies of this information that's being spread. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview. I don't know how visible this is for everyone, but here's what a result of a topic model might look like. Are the columns going down each model, each topic that we'll have to label and manually, and then the words that are associated with each one you can see. And the bigger the circle, the kind of more prominent it was in each topic. Next slide, please. And so now I can kind of highlight some of the major themes that were noticed over the months. And these are certainly not exhaustive, and Claire pointed out quite a lot of things that they've also written on. But I think these are the ones that are specifically pertaining to coronavirus, particularly potentially harmful, and kind of something that comes back a lot. So next slide, please. Sorry, one flat. Yeah. The first one is continually chipping away at public trust in organizations, and we've seen this happen at many levels and across basically all the time, from local hospitals, so saying that hospitals have a financial incentive to over-report the number of coronavirus cases they get because they get more money or they get more equipment, and whilst that is strictly true in some cases, that's not necessarily something that people are trying to exploit, or they're really projecting the malice onto people that put their lives on the line for us. And that goes up to state or regional officials that they cast out on, up to national and international WHO. So we've seen a lot of writing on alleged cover-ups with the Chinese government, or Director General Categorisations being quote-unquote the key cog in the propaganda machine, or withholding information where it's not even clear what information WHO was withheld at times. So then this is really, an ongoing thing. So next slide, please. And then, of course, another theme that we've seen is direct misinformation on treatments and how to tackle the virus itself. The most prominent of which is hydroxychloroquine. And of course, it's not the only one. There's been back and forth on other things like remdesivir, but hydroxychloroquine most prominently, because of course President Trump has talked about it. There's been a huge body of research now, kind of these short-term studies that come out, and there, of course, there's really no medical consensus, but to go back to the credibility characteristic of general news, often they will capitalize on very one particular thing that was said by this one person that really supports their narrative, and they'll tie it into the broader political agenda they're trying to push. And it really gets a big reaction from their followers on where these posts are shared. Next one. Of course, we've seen conspiracy theories pushed, most prominently about virus origin from the virology lab, articles about supposed intelligence from the US or elsewhere that it has originated from the lab, or that it's intentionally released as some mechanism in the Chinese economic engine. And one thing I'd also like to highlight about the last three themes that I've pointed out is these are all distracting from or any substantive action that they could be pointing the readers to, and that's also another level of damage that misinformation is causing here. Next slide, please. And finally, on the state-backed side, as we see often, using coronavirus and vaccine candidates or other aspects of progress in some way to highlight the global leadership, or the presenting leaders like President Putin as very generous or kind of magnanimous leader. And yeah, so I think that brings me to a close. I hope that gave some overview of what we've been doing and what we've been finding. So happy to take questions later.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Hubert. And I think, what you pointed to there with connections to the very big questions of trust when it comes to societies, being able to rely on any information in the context of this, disinfodemic, if you like, along with the heavily intertwined themes of political disinformation. So we'll come back to those, no doubt. And now we're moving to Alaphilippe, who is the Executive Director of EU DisinfoLab, who's going to be talking about a resource hub and crowdsourcing content and research and initiatives connected to combating COVID-19 disinformation. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Claire and Hubert. It's really a pleasure to share a session with you today. So we've been looking at the DisinfoLab also as Claire put out in her presentation, like where we can be useful in that kind of cascade of disinformation happening and trying to know what's going on in terms of disinformation, in terms of new research being published, new fact-checking, new narratives being published. And very quickly, we came up with this idea in the team to have like what we call the COVID-19 Resource Hub, which is basically a very simple thing if you think about it, is the amount of information that has been published around COVID-19, the amount of campaign, the amount of narrative that have circulated online during the whole outbreak of the pandemic has stressed out the need for people to actually find information. Because you were so overwhelmed, and we were so overwhelmed with all the studies that were published about so many things around the world, like what the platforms are doing to tackle this, what are the governmental initiatives, what is the WHO doing, what is the impact of disinformation and COVID-19. And we wanted to have some kind of place where we could put some of these useful resources for journalists. And I think what Claire illustrates, I think we had like a cascade of civil society being pressured to actually make a sense about what was going on. So you had first the fact checkers that was trying to fact check what was going on, then civil society people, then media literacy people, and then journalists trying to come back to reanalyze what has been done and what was the impact of this information. And actually that stressed and put the pressure on every one of us to find the right information and to find something which was useful to do our job as civil society. So we came up with this idea. We set up a page which basically is a mix of the great research that has been doing by the community. We've put some links from Oxford, the briefings, the work from Claire, but also studies from the BBC, study also from international organizations or academic centers. We did our own investigations about the information on COVID-19, also to have our own capacity to understand what was going on and to compare global trends that were happening in other parts of the world. So in April 2020, our researcher Roman has been doing, for instance, this analysis that you can find, which was comparing how the infodemic and the narratives were actually basically the same in every European country at the time where the outbreak and the pandemic was going on. And he was able to understand that actually the same narratives were going up country after country during different phases. It was an analysis at the time to see like what was the narrative when the outbreak was still in China, what was the narratives when the threat was getting closer, what was the narratives when actually we had lockdowns and we had the cure questions being brought up and the masks questions. And I think it was very helpful to understand these different phases, to actually trying to understand what might be the next step. Well, when the infodemic comes into your country, what possibly could be the next step into the narratives you will see in your own communities and your own monitoring. And today we are announcing a new research that we've been doing. So it's not published yet; it will be published tonight. But I have the pleasure to announce you a bit the last research of the COVID-19 Hub, which is a study. And I would like to thank our researcher Antoine Grégoire for this. Is a study about crowdfunding platforms and disinformation on COVID-19. And when we look at disinformation, we very often look at YouTube, at Facebook, at Google, at Twitter, sometimes at Reddit, but we very often forget a wide range of platforms online that can also be content repositories for this information. And we wanted to look specifically at the crowdfunding platforms, because they're also a part of monetization of this information. That's also a place when you can actually get money from doing this information online without a very complex advertisement system and having very simply people donating for you to do it. So what we realized that we're actually two models of doing COVID-19 disinformation on these crowdfunding platforms. The first one is what we call the direct model. It's basically on Patreon, for instance, you have the capacity yourself to create content on the platform and to only give access to people who actually pay for the content. So it's basically a paywall that is being implemented on these platforms, which is already accessible to funders of the project, and you can have access to premium content, let's say, which in that case would be this information around COVID-19. You have the other part of it, which is what we label indirect hosting of this information. It's basically you are someone who is producing this information on different platforms, on YouTube, on BitChute, on Reddit, on your website, and you use actually the crowdfunding platform to actually get money for yourself, and then you can do your content in another place. So we summarize this by this very simple scheme, like the direct hosting, where the crowdfunding platforms host the content, which is only available for the funders of the content, and the indirect hosting, which basically you get money to do approximately what you want and to have this information elsewhere. So example of this information we observe, for instance, on Patreon, we have an account called Stranger Than Fiction News, which publish a lot of daily disinformation pieces all around the COVID-19. We also had the documentaries, the coronavirus 19 conspiracy on Kickstarter, which is also another example. And sometimes also on GoFundMe, another organization which is called Ensemble Citoyen COVID and 5G, which also make a point linking COVID and 5G as the same issue, which is an organization in Belgium. So we can see that all of these organizations or individuals are using the platform as an entry point to actually raise money for their cause, which can be very often in the cases we studied, very oriented to publish and to produce this information on a regular basis. What we see is that, for instance, some of these platforms have specific policies. Patreon doesn't have a policy on this information, but for instance, Indiegogo and GoFundMe announced in 2019 they would ban anti-vax content, and they also removed campaign in 2020. So, for instance, you have this anti-mask campaign in Alaska that was on GoFundMe that has been taken down in July. And in only a few days, actually the campaign moved to another website, which is called Fundly, another crowdfunding platform, and actually collected the same money, even more than the money that was already raised on GoFundMe. So it's actually a scheme to show that these people that are on a platform, when they are moderated by the platform, they actually move to another platform, which is something we have seen in other spaces, people leaving Twitter to go on Gab, to go on Parler, kicked out from YouTube and going to BitChute. We have this model of people that once they are moderated in a platform, they're going to a less regarding platform in terms of moderation, and they have the capacity to continue to do exactly the same thing, and sometimes with more success. GoFundMe also announced in last year that they would not allow anti-vax campaign on the platform. We found anti-vax campaign on the platform, especially the one on the left, which is still active today and raised more than $86,000. We can see actually that coronavirus and vaccine is definitely something that is going on. We can see also that after moderation, which we think has been done mainly using a whitelist of words, so words that you cannot put in a petition or in a fundraising. Actually, people are moving to other things. So, for instance, if you won't find something about COVID 5G, but if you type respiratory problems and waves, you will find content that has been linked to this. So basically, the game for these actors is actually to change the words they're using to find similar words and to actually be able to continue. And it's a new cat and mouse game, whack-a-mole on these new platforms to actually being able to continue getting funds. So this raises a lot of conclusion and questions about these new type of actors that was not very much identified before in the disinformation space. Is that crowdfunding platforms have been crucial to support civil society initiatives to fight disinformation. I think that's very important to say. People like Bellingcat are funded through Patreon, so they're absolutely necessary. especially in a time where support to civil society is very complicated and funding to civil society is under threat because of an economic crisis, and the media sector, which is also in very large financial stress at the moment. So I think it's important to repeat this, but we also need to be sure that these platforms have been used as a new tool to monetize this information, and they are abused, or as the other platforms have been abused to do disinformation and to get money out of it. Some crowdfunding platforms have a policy against disinformation or harmful content. Some have not. So we also see here that there is a very big discrepancy on what's being done by the platforms, how they remove what they announce, what they do, what they don't do. We also, our study showed that terms of use are regularly abused, not only on disinformation and COVID, but on many other topics, whether it's about conspiracy books, on QAnon, whether it's about 5G, whether it's about health scams, etc. We can find numerous examples of how these terms of use are regularly abused, and the enforcement of these use and policies has shown discrepancy between platforms. They don't have the same way of dealing with it, and over time. They announce sometimes that they're doing something, and after a few months you can see that similar content is back online. So there is no consistency in that thing. And that raises a few questions, like is the role of these crowdfunding platforms similar to what other so-called gatekeepers are doing? So shall we consider them? We are actually considering about regulation of platforms. That's a huge discussion in the EU right now. So shall we also have a look at the crowdfunding platforms as players and stakeholders in this regulation discussion? And what kind of transparency into the processes can provide further funding for disinformation and other harmful activities? I think we also need to understand better what are the policies that can be in place to understand where the money is going, how, what entities are also benefiting from this support, and what can be done in case of harmful or sometimes illegal activity. One of our study last year on white supremacists in France showed that one of the platforms, TP, has been used by these white supremacists to actually fund a YouTube channel where they invited white supremacists to talk on YouTube. So I think the whole question of what has been done and what could be done on this platform is also a new question. So the COVID Hub is trying to have a look, also different looks at what is done by platforms and what is being done by the platforms over COVID-19. What do they announce? Because we have a lot of an announcement and a lot of public relations right now. And I think the question right now is also to be sure to understand what is actually being done, and Oxford has done a great job this week about a YouTube video on health misinformation and COVID disinformation. I think it's important to actually check what the platforms are doing. That's the parts of the role that civil society should be playing now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. And if no platform will be untouched, I guess, is the scenario that we're dealing with in this, in this combat, which is really what it feels like as we particularly, head towards the second wave of the pandemic, with a very important US election, with waves of protests around the world connected to hate speech, all being facilitated by the platforms. And many of the questions we've had from our audience members today do go to the question of the platforms, unsurprisingly, particularly given the very fraught and toxic debate that's going on internationally with Facebook at its centre. And so let me pick up first on that question before we go specifically to some of the audience questions. I mean, Claire, you pointed to a chat you had earlier today in some sort of meeting with the platforms, making the point that civil society organisations are being effectively exploited for their services, being worked into the ground, trying to do the work that should be on the platforms themselves. So how do we actually ensure that there is appropriate funding or appropriate responsibility on their side, but in a way that is distant from the sort of control that the Facebooks of the world would like to exert, which we know they do try to exert with their public influence operations, disinformation tactics even at times. So how can we credibly, as civil society organisations, do that work, take money from platforms, undertake research they potentially also fund. I mean, there's so much bound up in this in terms of trust, and it's very murky. And, you know, many of us have received funding from the platforms in this work. So how, starting with you, Claire, how do you interpret that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, we've been scrabbling around, they've been scrabbling around, I get it, but it's 2020 now. There needs to be a centralized fund that they put into that fund and it gets managed independently. Because we also need serious philanthropists to realize you don't fund year to year, you give people multi-year grants. If you gave organizations 5 years, we wouldn't be losing sleep because we'd know that we had enough money for 5 years. That's what the Ford Foundations of this world do. They're not philanthropists. Ultimately, they, you know, AFP has just announced something with TikTok today. Great, TikTok's now getting to a fact-checking world. But we can't have piecemeal, you know, we need to be unionized. Is everybody getting paid the same? We have to think much more strategically about the way that we work with the platforms. And this morning I was listening to public radio in New York. They're now funded by Facebook, and they did a story on Facebook. I have to say in brackets, just to let you know, we're funded by Facebook. Facebook shouldn't be advertising on WNYC in an election period to say, look at all the things we're doing around an election. We have to have an independent body that has a ton of money. Google announced today $1 billion for publishers. We all know why that is happening, because the publishers have kicked back and said, we're going to do something about this. These companies have a lot of money. Small non-profits should not have to be losing sleep. This is the biggest issue in the world, and people like me and Alex should not be losing sleep about how can we survive next year. It is bonkers. So we just need to be much more strategic, much more aligned, and the platforms need to have an independent body because they're soft power. There's a ton of things I don't say because they fund us, and so we have to be much more strategic about this.
And perhaps it's actually time. I mean, how do we actually consciously uncouple from the platforms at this point? You know, and if we do that,
we can't because they've given us enough money that most of those faces that you saw, their salaries are funded by them. Do I want to stop them from having a salary? No. So it's that we made mistakes. It's a trap. We made mistakes early on. We didn't see that we had power, and now we've got to fight back and say that we need to, in the same way as the publishers have, be at the bargaining table.
Yeah, I mean, just to point out, I didn't say this before, Claire, but you were one of the peer reviewers on that UN study, and in fact, Alex, one of your colleagues, was a researcher on that. We made the recommendation that there needed to be an independent fund, an independent body to ensure that any funding coming from the platforms to work in this disinformation space was in fact genuinely independent, not just a PR exercise, and that's exactly what you highlighted.
We did that in 2018 with the EU Code of Disinformation. We said exactly the same thing. These are not new arguments, but nobody's listening.
Yeah, and so let's hope that at some point in a year where there's a great reckoning across a whole range of boundaries. Alex, you had your hand up. You want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to second Claire on this. I think that's really, really important. We've been pushing at the European level to have a decentralized funding of civil society on this, and I think the response that is brought now is whether you get funded by philanthropy, and that's complicated on the long term, whether you get funded by the platforms or whether now there is this new philosophy of hubs funded by the European Commission, which is basically forcing people to do a certain number of investigations per year, a certain number of things, and we can't work like this. We can't work on a deliverable basis. We can't work on, we have to do 10 fact checks a month to get your money. That's not how we work. It's not a supply market. It shouldn't be a supply market, because as the moment we enter a supply market, we have to enter into production of the information debunking, and we're not doing our job. Like our job at DisinfoLab, most of our job is doing investigations. Most of the time we start investigation, we don't find anything, so we don't publish. So the thing is, if we are forced to do investigation because we only paid if we do disinformation investigations, at the end we will produce bad investigation because we will just have to publish to get our money back. And I think that's the worst thing to do. We should have a sustainable funding on a multi-year, and to have also small funding for small actors. Many of the actors, specifically in Europe, are very small actors that have very low support to do disinformation fact-checking in their own communities, their own countries. We need to have a mechanism that can help these people to be sustainable. And also, I'm adding on this that tackling disinformation is costly. It's costly in terms of resources, security, but also on social risks. Like people are paid less that they could be paid at a platform, for instance. So we're not we're not getting a lot of money of this. We're taking a lot of personal risks and a lot of social risks. Like most of the people we have in our teams are actually on a close to burnout after this year. And that's very worrying, because if we're not here next year, if nobody from the community is here next year, what will happen? That's going to be the chaos, the informational chaos. And we have this duty. We are one of the first line people as a community. And if we don't have this going on, if we don't have the security to know that we have the way to build something which is sustainable, that we can work cooperatively in the next years, it's gonna be awful, and people will leave. People will leave because you can't do this all your life at that rhythm. That's not sustainable.
It's like clearing landmines, but using, people who have the least power and the least capacity to do that job. And the other thing I would say, speaking from my experience, and I've also, received funding via Oxford University from Facebook to do research on journalism. So, and my organisation currently takes money from Facebook and other platforms. So this is not said without experience, but for me, there's also a question not just of the industrial costs and the risks, but freedom of expression risks, because we are being, ineffective in many ways. We are reluctant to be critical, as Claire indicated, as well as feeling exploited. So there's very big questions here to civil society, I think, going forward in how we tackle disinformation and how we do that collaboratively. Hubert, I don't know if you have anything to add, or if you, in fact, at the Oxford Internet Institute also are in this space of trying to do research on the platforms while receiving funding from them.
Yeah, so I think various business department will have to see funding from social media, and for ourselves specifically, we're very aware of this as well. We take funding from a bunch of different places, not specifically from Facebook, but this is definitely something we're aware of. And for me personally, I'm relatively new to the world of academia, so I defer to your experience, but I agree with everything that's been said.
Great. And I think let's go to some of the questions from our audience now. Have we got a bit of extra time? We're effectively supposed to be ending, but I think we should talk to our audience. Great. Everyone's saying go for it, so I'm going to go for it. The one thing that came out there was about the importance of collaboration and organising. I think that's a really critical message to take away from this too. And I know we'll be doing work with you, Alex, on this point as well. So a question from Amanda Leal de Lima from the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro. And in fact, it goes to this question of working with people on the ground. Claire, I think you raised this about the need to have global South perspectives and experience on the ground to fight disinformation horizontally. She says. So, are there examples of that happening that you guys know of? Collaborations that do, in fact, in an ongoing way, enable the involvement of people in communities where the brunt of this crisis is often borne out, in a most costly way.
Yeah, so just say, we have seen some great collaborations in this space. IFCN have done some great ones. We've seen, we've been involved in ones around elections. There's been some excellent ones over the last 4 years. But I do think, how do we actually work with community organisations? Those of us who do this work know that bad actors understand that this world is networked. They create large-scale WhatsApp groups that are interconnected. Those of us who work in the quality information space, we still think like broadcasters. We think, well, if we have a big enough Twitter account or a big enough Facebook page, we'll be able to hit people. And when you say, well, have you created a networked community? No, because that would be activism, and that's not what we do in the journalism or checking space. And so, again, it's like another one of those asymmetrical things. So we are working in the run-up to the election with community organizations who represent Latinx communities and Black communities. And it's been this incredible moment of recognizing, hearing from those communities, working with those communities. It's not this kind of trust us, we're journalists model. And I don't know how we bring many of those grassroots communities into the kind of collaborations we're working on, because it's critical. So I think that's the next phase that we're going to see in this work, which is exciting. It's messy, it's time consuming, but if we don't do that, we're completely missing both ways of listening, but ways of engaging and pushing out quality information.
I've studied an example of this with Rappler in the Philippines, which is the organization established by Maria Ressa. And we're working in this space with EU DisinfoLab as well, trying to examine these things. So there's other examples to come. But Alex, do you want to put some meat on that with some other examples?
not this specific example, but yeah, we're going to look with Maria-Ressa and Rappler on how this information and how the tools that have been developed for Western countries are on the platforms, such as fact-checking on the platforms, are not developed in every country. So I think there is also a way to understand that the tools that we have in Europe are not developed in Pakistan, are not developed sometimes in the Philippines. So that's also very important to know that we are not also all equal in the way we can have data from the platforms or libraries or that kind of things. And I think another thing I want to mention on this is there is a fantastic paper from ISD in Chloe Colliver. I don't know if Chloe is here, but she released recently something very interesting on how to build communities and how to collaborate together on this information. And I think it's definitely an area where we should focus on to have more discussion on this and to provide more resources to everyone. I think that was a bit the idea we had with the COVID hub, and to give resources to people that they actually can start to do something. They actually can start to do things themselves and get in touch with people. I think that's very important. This conference also is here for this, for people to actually meet. We hope to be in a physical conference as soon as possible, but to start these kind of things. And please use the conference as a way, and we're happy to put people in touch. We're happy to give emails, because we need to actually work as a community on this. If we only work on our own, we can have our small successes. We can say it's very good on our own Twitter page, and yeah, but the job is not done. That's not our job. The job is actually to make sure that the thing that we found are useful for the other people at the other side of the room and the other side of the world. And I think that's what our mission is right now, altogether as a community.
And I think we've touched a nerve with this conversation, because many of the questions go to the issue of the effort and exhaustion and overwork and overload that go with these sorts of approaches that are required. You know, these collaborative approaches are intense and involve an awful lot of logistical work. It's very hard, but very essential. And one of the questions that's come through is actually about that issue of access to data, and I think, Hubert, I think you pointed this out. I'm not sure, Claire, if I recall correctly, you're doing it as well, but where there are gaps, yes, you were talking about your Sheffield project, Claire, so where there are gaps in data, certainly that's, you know, from one perspective, it's about gaps in information available to the audience, but for the researchers working in organisations countering disinformation, it's how do you get access to the data? And there is a perception, I'm paraphrasing a question here, about that access being granted to people who work with the platforms, who are perceived to be, you know, effectively loyal, but who are also perceived to be very efficient. And so you find yourself working harder and staying more mute to try and get access to the data. So is there something else that needs to be done beyond, say, an independent and really genuinely independent fund to support this work? Perhaps some way of ensuring that data is securely delivered in a fairly distributed way to independent researchers, for example. Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. So we, part of our work is doing civil society workshops with various places around the world. And so one recently, just before the pandemic, we were in Tunisia, and on data access there is really poor. So, you know, in the US and UK, the Facebook ad library, they talk a lot about that, and supposedly it will have archives for 7 years or something like that. But that just isn't true in a lot of non-Western countries who also have elections going on, are equally important. And not just that, you know, access to tools like CrowdTangle are very limited. That is unclear. So we're lucky that we do have access, but and having access, I touched on some limitations with the data that's delivered. You know, there are still limitations to what we can do with that. So definitely collaborations and pressuring social media platforms more, and it has worked somewhat in the past in the MENA region. So yeah, definitely there are limitations here.
Thank you, Hubert. And Alex, you want to have the final say? This is where we'll wrap up after this.
Yeah, it's just like I know that we have a few people working with MEPs in the room. I just I think data is important. I'm just very worried that we focus too much on data and not how much on how we can manage data. Like if I would be a platform right now, I would give tons of data to people that people can't analyze, and my transparency job is done. So I think the question is how we have first a civil society who can deal with data, who has enough funding, enough structure, enough staff to actually do the job, and then have the data. But I think if we focus only on the data and distribution of data and what data we want, we're actually getting into a trap, which might be a deadly trap. So we need to have first funding, secured funding, sustainable funding, independent funding, and independent organization working on that can be fully staffed, that can work on this, that can have the infrastructure. Once we have this, we can have as much as data as you want. We will have the capacity to deal with it. But funding and sustainability goes first, I think.
That's a really important point, and you know, we've seen the so-called tools of freedom of expression, the social platforms weaponized for disinformation. You've pointed out, Alex, we're seeing the crowdfunding sites that many independent journalists and civil society organizations use to try to fund, the access to reliable and credible information being weaponized. And what you just described as the potential kind of weaponization of a transparency project is really kind of worrying and an important thought to have. And I just have this image of kind of, old school legal tricks of just a massive data dump, on the plaintiff or the defendant as a way of trying to deflect and frustrate. So I think that's a really smart idea on which to leave this conversation. It's been fascinating and really valuable, and people have been frank and honest, and I think that's so important in a world of untruth, where we're just yearning for a renaissance of truth. So thank you very much, Claire Wardle, Alex Alaphilippe, and Hubert Au, and I'm sorry, Hubert, just tell us how we say your name before we go. I should have done that.
How is good.
Okay, thanks so much, and yes, stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Julie, Alex, Claire, Hubert. Thank you all. We will be meeting for the final day of our conference tomorrow. As in today, we start at 2:15 Brussels time. Our first session will be an interview between Diana Wallis, former MEP and Vice President of the European Parliament and EU DisinfoLab board member, who will be speaking with Vera Jourova. We will also then have a session on protecting transparency in elections and safeguarding democracy that will be moderated by Susan Morgan and joined by Raphael Goldswig, Research Coordinator at Democracy Reporting International, by Julian Darsh at SNV, by Marie-Hélène Boulanger, Head of Unit at the DG Justice, and by Rasto Kuzel, Executive Director of Memo 98. So a great panel also for tomorrow to close our conference. Thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Bye.